Welcome to Canada's Social Changemakers. My name is Justin Douglas, and today we're going to be talking about restorative justice. What is restorative justice? Well, to help answer that question, joining me are Christianne Paras, the Executive Director of Restorative Justice, British Columbia, and contributing author of Colorizing Restorative Justice, as well as Gillian Lindquist, the Executive Director of Restorative Justice, Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm also coming to you from the unceded territories of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, also known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, as well as the Wasanich peoples. And I sit on the board of Restorative Justice, full disclosure. So thank you again both for being here today. So to get things started, just what is restorative justice at its most basic concept? How would each of you describe restorative justice? Christianne, let's start with you.
It is a lens looking at justice, looking at values that are inherent in justice, such as accountability, community, and even often there's a reference to healing, which I know isn't a term legally that is often used in justice. I think restorative justice is a framework of principles that provide a process of bringing people together and having a dialogue around the impact of harm and crime, and coming to a resolution around what needs to happen both for the individuals impacted and involved in that particular incident, as well as the larger community. That's how I've come to define it. I think that restorative justice is also a way of life for many people. I think for many Indigenous communities, not just here on Turtle Island, but across the world, it is a way of life, negotiating conflicts among different tribes. It's also used often to pass down knowledge. And so I think restorative justice from a cultural lens is also something that's been done years and years and years before it was ever formalized into what is now called restorative justice. And so I just want to add that piece as well.
Nice. Gillian, how would you define restorative justice at its most basic definition?
There's a definition. There's lots of formal definitions of restorative justice out there. The one that I like in terms of an actual definition is the one that was provided by Howard Zehr in his updated little book of restorative justice that was released in 2015. And he says that restorative justice is an approach to achieving justice that involves, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense or injustice, in order to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. And as Christianne identified, it can often look like people coming together for something that looks like a face-to-face discussion, and sometimes it's indirect communication, and there's lots of different ways that it can actually look, but those are some of the core elements that are in place.
Nice. And so for people who might not know much about restorative justice, how would you say it differs from what we would consider traditional justice in Canada? Christianne, let's start with you again.
I guess I want to just acknowledge, I think the word traditional justice, I use perhaps the term I would use is the mainstream justice.
Mainstream justice, sure.
And so I think the mainstream justice system, as we've become familiar with it, is the criminal justice system, the system involving police at the initial kind of entry point, and then the court process, and then corrections as the post court process. The criminal justice system as it exists right now is colonial and very adversarial. So for me, that to me is what comes to mind when I think about the mainstream traditional justice system. depending on what worldview you have, what traditional worldview you have.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, there's a couple things that stand out to me, and I think similar to Christianne, there's like, how do we even describe the criminal justice system? I think the terminology I've landed on lately is the criminal legal system. It's not necessarily a system of justice per se. I think there would be many people and groups in society who would say that our legal system is not a justice system. It is a legal system. It's based on legal frameworks and laws. A couple of the things that really stand out to me where it differs from restorative justice is one of them is participation. You know, who actively and most primarily and centrally participates in the criminal legal system. I mean, we think of lawyers and judges as being really key players in those systems, have a lot of authority, have really central roles. Whereas in restorative justice, the key players would be, you know, the victim, affected person, the offender, or the person who caused harm. There is also often family and community participation in those processes as well. And those folks really are the key players. And another piece that stands out to me is the direction of accountability. You know, when an offender is in the criminal legal system, they're being held accountable to the Crown. And in restorative justice, that accountability is direct to the victim and other people impacted by their actions. And no participation looks so much different. An offender can go through the court system and never have to say a word, like literally never have to say anything. Whereas in restorative justice, there's an obligation to speak to one's actions and to listen, and same for the victim in the criminal legal system. You know, they might say for example, testify or give testimony or write a victim impact, complete a victim impact statement and read that aloud, but they're very structured in terms of what they can speak to it and what they can ask for.
Yeah, and just listening to both of you speak, I think I would retract my term of traditional and probably put in dominant. The dominant justice system at this point. But we're all learning together, and that's why we have these conversations, is to educate ourselves and learn terminologies. Maybe can you talk about now where you're both at in terms of the work that you do? So Gillian, you're the Executive Director of Restorative Justice Victoria. What does your job entail on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I've been with the organization for just over 10 years. Like Christianne, when I first started with Restorative Justice Victoria, there was one part-time paid position, and I got it. And luckily, over the years, we've been able to grow and develop, and we have, you know, more staff. Currently, we have how many of us are now? Five staff members. And but yeah, so for my role, because we're a small team, we all sort of chip in on almost everything. We're not at that point yet where we have like this department and that department. It's like a collective of folks doing their best, really, and we're very lucky to have the people here that we do. But so I do a lot of the case management. So I'm the one that, you know, intakes most of the files, especially the more serious crime files, and does all the intake and assessment, and then supports the file as through conclusion. I don't do much of the face-to-face client casework anymore, where doing the preparation and the dialogues and those sorts of things, mainly due to the fact that I have two wonderful little kidlets who take up much of my time, and I am just here working part-time right now. And so, but we have other folks that do that work for us, but I support the file to conclusion, and I'm really fortunate. One of the things I do enjoy about my work is being able to sort of see that file from beginning to end and stay connected to the people involved, and, you know, be with them at the beginning and then talk to them again at the end, and, you know, get to see really what is for many people a really transformative experience as they go through and complete the restorative justice process. In addition to that, I liaise with the stakeholders. I do a lot of community consultation and community relationship building. That's something that I'm doing more and more of, and we really value. Historically, we've been quite tied to the criminal justice system, and as Christianne has sort of mentioned or alluded to, and I'm sure she'll speak to more later, is the restorative justice field is having a bit of a reckoning right now, an appropriate reckoning around some of the ways in which the field has not served many groups, and so one of the things that we are doing at our organization is we want to, of course, you know, keep our relationships within the criminal justice system, but acknowledge that the criminal justice system isn't a place for where all people feel safe or well served. And so we want to be more engaged in the community and serving individuals and addressing harms that are not necessarily coming to the attention of the criminal justice system, but still are deserve a restorative response. So doing a lot more community work and community building and fundraising and training and public education and all that sort of thing. It's a little bit different sort of every day, but we are very busy with all of those things and our caseload and everything that we have going on, and feel really fortunate to be in an organization that's growing and has a great team. And I think we're going through some really important internal shifts as an organization as well. And it's really exciting to be a part of that. And we've brought Christianne on and some of that work to help us and support us in that too. So yeah, it feels good.
Great. Christianne, what do you do on a daily basis in your restorative justice world?
Well, first I just want to say, when Gillian said they have 5 staff members, I mean, in restorative justice, that's like huge. That's a really full staff, staff team, because there's programs across BC that operate on like one person at a part-time level. So now I am the executive director for Restorative Justice Association of BC. It's the first association that represents programs across the province that are doing restorative justice work. It's, I can't say enough about the journey that it took for that association to form. I was initially part of the steering committee that was tasked with looking into what that would look like. And so now to be in the position I'm in now as executive director, essentially my role for RJABC, which is our acronym that we've become known for, is overseeing the day-to-day operations, a lot of administrative work, but also the work that I really enjoy is relationship building, connecting with the members of the association, which are practitioners and programs across BC, connecting with them through various projects that our committees of the board are undertaking, but also connecting with them as practitioners and just having conversations around some of the challenges that they're experiencing in their programs, and just a chance to talk about some of the shifts that they're looking and are excited about in restorative justice as a field. So that's been a really big part of my role. I'm very new to my role. I think I've been in my role for about 3 months. And prior to that, I was involved in training and training, as well as doing a lot of consultation with both RJ programs, but also with schools and other organizations that wanted to implement a restorative justice practice, starting with policies to an actual model that they felt was appropriate for their particular organization. I'm also the co-founder of a collaboration called Roots, Reclaiming Our Own Truths and Stories. I co-founded that with a friend of mine, Erica Littlewolf, who's from Northern Cheyenne out in Montana. And she and I were both co-authors for our chapter in the Colorizing Restorative Justice book.
Right here, you can see it again right now.
There it is. And so we, Erica and I, essentially we started a journey in writing that article and found ourselves having a lot of discussions around restorative justice and what restorative justice meant for her as an Indigenous person who had always, known what restorative justice was, done it in practice with her community, and just, suddenly there was this term for it. And so she and I started sharing stories about what restorative justice actually meant for us from each of our cultural lenses. And then all these questions came up about the practice of restorative justice from that cultural colorized lens. And so Roots was born from those discussions. A lot of the work we do is consulting with organizations who are trying to dismantle some of the dynamics that often occur in colonial structures, and providing support around looking at power and privilege, and the different ways that white supremacist culture can manifest in those three tiers, from the personal to the interpersonal to the systemic. And so we've been doing and engaging that work, and we're very excited about a lot of the things that we've been getting a chance to do. I think it's also very timely in a time of having discussions around anti-racism. Erica and I have been doing anti-racism work and anti-oppression work for a very long time. So that's another piece that I'm doing. And then I'm also teaching at Simon Fraser University for their certificate course for schools. So for me, a lot of the work now that I'm very passionate about is supporting organizations who, whether they're fairly new to restorative justice or have been doing restorative justice for a long time, to just look at the policies, their practices, and looking at the culture within their organizations, and where perhaps there may be gaps in order to truly have the kind of practices that would be inviting for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Like, where are there gaps in having opportunities to engage with people that are often marginalized from those conversations around justice, but also just in terms of engagement as well. And so that's my passion at this moment. That's where I am in my restorative justice journey right now, is really trying to propel this movement around colorizing restorative justice.
So not much on your plate, either of you. Pretty, just kidding. You guys are doing amazing work, and it's really intense and difficult, but rewarding and challenging, and all these different things. And sort of moving into some of the work that you're doing, Christianne, my first exposure really to restorative justice when I was at McGill Law, I was lucky enough to participate in a field course when I went to Ganawage Reserve just over the island of Montreal, and I spent a week living and camping and working in the community and meeting different community members. And part of that was a legal training session at restorative justice. And so I got a lot out of it, but in my own lack of understanding and knowledge, I just really thought restorative justice came from Indigenous traditions. And that was just how it entered into the dominant system. And then, my somewhat not educated, cisgendered, not straight white self had to learn that that's actually not the case, that there's been some cultural appropriation, there's been some use of traditional Indigenous knowledge, but that restorative justice actually has its own way of how it's developed. And so maybe can you talk a little bit about that and the work that you've already mentioned it, but a little bit deeper into the work that you're trying to do to bring these things to light and to make these sort of monumental changes within the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as I progress in my practice in restorative justice, and as I was invited to many Indigenous communities to offer trainings, oftentimes it was trainings around victim offender dialogue, victim offender conferencing. There was a lot of discussions around, you know, the fact that a lot of these values that restorative justice often, holds up in their principles, are very much values that a lot of Indigenous communities have, have been practicing for a really long time, but they've never called it restorative justice. And so, I think that one of the things that I want to clarify though is that the values itself, I think, probably are rooted in a lot of Indigenous justice practices, but also a lot of many cultural communities hold these values to be important as well in the way that they conduct themselves, the protocols that they have in their communities, the way they negotiate when there's conflict or harm that's occurred. Um, but I guess I wanna acknowledge the fact that the biggest thing to me, from my observations, the biggest thing that restorative justice has co-opted is circle processes. I think the victim offender dialogue and is probably rooted in the conferencing model. Often, it's often referenced. It's taken from the conferencing model that was practiced by the Maori in New Zealand. But I've met a few academics as well as practitioners who are Indigenous, who would counter that and say, the way that's been adopted is not true to the way that the Indigenous people used to practice it. But with conversations with various Indigenous nations, they have said, circle process is really the one process that looks very, very, very similar to the practices that they've done for years and years, and now it's been taken as a model of restorative justice. And so what is our responsibility in restorative justice to acknowledge that, right? That the co-opting of that particular practice, and what is our responsibility in restorative justice in acknowledging that that we're complicit to colonization in the act of taking something that is that has been practiced by Indigenous people and have basically adopted it into our own practice. And there are RGA practitioners that are going back to those to Indigenous communities and training Indigenous people on practices that they've long practiced themselves and perhaps have lost along the way, or I would say it's been taken away from them because of colonization. And so where are we complicit in that? So those things, I think, are something that we're wrestling with right now. How is restorative justice acknowledging the way that we've taken part in that colonial structure? And it's a tough question. It's a tough conversation, but it's a really necessary conversation. I think that there's a lot of questions that arise for me in looking at restorative justice from a decolonizing lens, the way that we define community even is, whose communities do we center, and who determines what community is. Even for myself as a practitioner in restorative justice, my primary community is not my work community, it's my cultural community. And so do we actually acknowledge that in restorative justice, or do we just assume that community means the same for everybody, right? And so there's a lot of those kinds of conversations that are really important. Healing is also a really big piece in restorative justice. We talk about healing, we talk about how restorative justice can be healing, but there are various forms of healing. And from a cultural perspective, identity is a big piece of healing. The restoration and the reclamation of identity is incredibly important. How are we doing that in restorative justice? I think that is something that I've not yet seen in this work. And it hasn't been something that's been fully fleshed out as a way of addressing, that part of trauma-informed practice is, that assessment of identity, and that, the inclusion of ceremonies or practices that would help someone be more connected to that part that's been fractured. And so I think those are all the things that are really alive in the discussions right now that I'm engaged in when it comes to restorative justice, and some of the shifts that I'm hoping to see shift in the next few years.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I mean, it's such an important and sometimes difficult conversation to have, and how can things change if we don't talk about it, and that's it. We all have to be having these conversations together. And I've always wondered that too, even from, the dominant justice perspective, having Indigenous people or people of color have their lives and fates determined by a panel, and even women to a large extent, a panel of white men getting to create the rules and then tell people that they have to now have these outcomes for their lives based on these rules that they've created, and moving that even into restorative justice of having these healing processes where there aren't necessarily people who are on the decision-making process who reflect the people and values who are going through the process. And so, I mean, that's a big conversation that I think we're having, and it's cool that we can talk about it so openly together. There's a lot more to talk about it, but we've been talking for a long time, and I want to talk about also the financial aspect a little bit, and how is restorative justice more financially beneficial compared to dominant justice systems? If yes, how? If no, how? What are your thoughts on the money around restorative justice, Gillian?
There's been some research done. There's limited, like good research, and there's a number of reasons for that. There hasn't been a lot done locally or even in the Canadian context, I would say. There are a number of folks in the RJ practitioner community who have been saying, like certainly from a research perspective, restorative justice has huge financial benefits. I can speak a little bit to what those are in a moment, but there's also been people in the practitioner community and in the movement who've been saying, let's just be cautious of claiming that restorative justice is like cheap, that like it doesn't cost money, because it does. And the reason that it's been, the effectiveness of restorative justice, there's a number of metrics around that, like what does make restorative justice effective, successful. But, a lot of that is associated to, the people doing the work and the resources available within the community and resources available within the program or the system that's doing the restorative justice work. So restorative justice has been historically, at least in BC, very, very cheap, because it's been done predominantly by not-for-profit organizations who have, as Christianne mentioned, sometimes not any staff, completely volunteer-driven, sometimes a very part-time person who works, and then the rest is all volunteers. But that model, from my perspective, will keep restorative justice really on the fringes, and is something that we need to shift away from. Not from using volunteers or being based in the community, those sorts of things, but wanting to do restorative justice for nothing is not something that we need to shift from that perspective. But of the research that has been done on the cost effectiveness of restorative justice, some of the benefits that have been identified are things like repeat offending. So, again, the statistics on this do vary, but there is consensus in the research that restorative justice does reduce repeat offending, and the statistics on that really vary. Again, usually associated to the effect, like the quality of the program for sure, but then also the resources available in the community for the participants, the resources that they can access. So, and then there's things like, of course, a reduction just in court costs. So if something is diverted out of the criminal legal system into restorative justice, there's not going to be all the associated costs of the system. Then there's for a lot of the research demonstrates that victims who go through restorative justice leave the processes in a better place, often quite satisfied. Not always, of course. There is work to do in this area of working with victims as well. But one of the things that has come out of quite a lot of the research is that victims who are well served in restorative justice are less likely to experience the long-term traumatic offense of an injustice or of wrongdoing. So, and the same can be true said for offenders who are well served in restorative justice, is that there's a very likely chance that they're not going to have to draw on as many of the same like social systems for supports going forward. So there was a really comprehensive study done in the UK that found that it was like a 8-year study done by an independent body, and their assessment at the end of the day was every euro that you spend on restorative justice, you will gain 8 euros essentially. So it is, I think there is some general consensus, that restorative justice, does reduce costs at the front end, but also upstream cost benefits as well. So I think for many folks in the RJ community who have to literally fight for every dollar we get, it is a real scramble and a huge amount of effort put into generating the funds associated with doing this work in the community. It's a real conflict to see the really clear evidence, I think, to say that restorative justice has a number of benefits, a lot of benefits, and cost savings is one of them. But yet we continue to really struggle and have not in any way, shape, or form reached anything that looks like core or stable funding for this work here in BC. We're a really long ways from that.
Yeah, intuitively also, I would just think that again, I have no facts or statistics or anything, but the cost of sitting in front of a judge, the cost of the lawyer fees, the costs of incarceration, the costs of healing. I mean, just to be able to have, if healing is one of the outcomes that happens through this process, I mean, it's even hard to put a monetary amount on the lives and the changes of behavior that could take place, as opposed to the alternative, which is feeling that there's been an injustice that has taken place, or that there's an incarceration and that person is likely to go out and reoffend because there's been no rehabilitation services or all of these other things. So I also feel like there's a lot of hidden cost benefits that need to be explored a lot more within the service. And I really hope that BC and Canada in general can do some more research in order to create stable funding for the important work that you do. Last question, what are your hopes and aspirations, each of you, for the future of restorative justice in your own work practices in British Columbia, in Canada, and across generally restorative justice? Christianne, what are your hopes?
Mm-hmm. The one moment that I've dreaded that moment where you say something and you're on mute. Like the phrase of 2020, you're on mute.
Yeah, unmute yourself, please.
It's a whole new world.
That's a good question, Justin. I personally, I hope that restorative justice is moving towards a shift where like moving towards a shift. I think that where diversity will be not just a word that people understand and adopt and use, but like have a real sense of what that actually means. The term inclusion, to actually really adopt and understand what that truly means. And I say that as a personal thing because only this past year have I felt that restorative justice is also open and inviting and applicable to a person of color like myself. That too will be a safe space for me. And so I hope that shift is happening. And that I recognize that the work that I have to do as a person of color to make a shift in a space in which I can be a part of that space is going to be very different from that of my colleagues who are who are white and perhaps have had that space and those processes accessible to them and have never had to question whether that was a space that was safe for them. So I hope that there can be some co-conspiratorship, allyship, whatever term you want to adopt or use, or I hope that there can be some joint work around that, and there can be some conversations around like co-liberation. What does it look like for us to create spaces where we can both be in that space and retain who we are as people, and not have to negotiate out any parts of our identity to be able to be in that space together. So that's a really important piece for me. Um, I would love to see RJABC support programs across BC um, to feel more um, feel more supported around the training piece. There's been so many discussions over the years about best practices, and we still stumble into this disparity of some programs have capacity and some programs do not, because as Gillian pointed out, they're fighting for every dollar that they can get, and that money is going towards funding their program, paying for that part-time staff member. And so I really hope that RJABC can be a part of supporting something that would allow for best practices to really be feasible for all programs, not just the programs that can afford it. And I think just in the communities that I currently am working in and serving, I hope that there can be more conversations around how RJ can be utilized for the increase of racialized incidents that we are seeing in our communities, in our local communities. There's an increase in anti-Asian racism. There's been a huge research around, is racism real in Canada? That's essentially what this research was attempting to answer. And the fact that we're having to answer that question still as a nation is shocking to me as a person of color, because yes, racism is very real. But now that there's actual statistics and there's people that are sharing those statistics and recognizing the perspectives of people who do experience racism. And there's been a lot of conversations that have started to bubble up around, can we address, some of those racialized incidents through restorative justice? Is there capacity there? Is there potential for transformation there that RJ can support? I would love for more of those conversations. And I hope that that is something that we will see unfold in the next few months, years. I don't want to operate from a place of urgency because I know that change takes time. Authentic, real, meaningful change takes time, but those are my hopes. And yeah, I know that I'll definitely be engaged in what in how I can contribute in any way to those changes, because those changes not only impact me as a practitioner but also as a person of color. It's you know um, it's something that I've really longed for. Um, and it's interesting that I started this conversation talking about community and how restorative justice was something I was introduced to initially with the realization that community is very important to me. And, I'm at a point now, 20 years later, when I'm like, I don't actually really have meaningful community in restorative justice. And now I'm having to restart another journey on redefining community. in restorative justice for me. So yeah, big hopes.
Thank you. I echo all of everything you said. I just really have the same hopes that all of those things come to manifest as well. Gillian, for you, final thoughts, hopes for the future.
Ooh, yeah, this is a big one. There's a couple of things that stand out for me. I mean, I think I continue to see in my sort of day-to-day life and in the work that we do here. And for me, as I mentioned, I do, all of sort of the liaising and most of the liaising with stakeholders and folks in the community is there's just really the sense that restorative justice continues to be on the fringes. It's not really seen, I think, well, for many people, it's not understood. A lot of people don't even know what the term means or have heard the term. And then those who have heard the term, there's often a lot of misconceptions or a lack of understanding about what it is. And then within the criminal justice system, there can be a real resistance to restorative justice, seeing it as maybe soft on crime, or some of these beliefs that these values that the criminal legal system holds that they feel don't resonate with restorative justice approaches. And I think for me, I really have a strong hope that we'll start to see restorative justice not as something that's just used in these very small, minute cases, often in situations where, for example, the offender comes from a good home, that can be some of the terminology that's used, why a case we refer to restorative justice. So, certainly it can often be used for folks that have or have more privilege and is not necessarily being utilized within groups and for groups that have been more historically marginalized. And so I really hope that restorative justice will be adopted socially and within our communities as a response to wrongdoing that is valuable, and where there's belief in what it has to offer. I also really hope that restorative justice will, at least in our community here, it will deeply sink into the community and be really connected to the community in ways that it hasn't been before. So again, at least in our program, we have been quite tied to the criminal justice system, and we're wanting to now be, I think, more of service to the community writ large, and especially to folks who historically have not been well served by the restorative justice movement. So that's a really big hope for me. And I do, if restorative justice is to get any traction, it does need to be appropriately supported and funded. And I do have a fear that, with funding might come sort of co-opting, where it gets sort of taken away from the community and delivered by government. And I think that would be a huge loss to restorative justice and to the communities. So, I certainly hope that it can continue to remain as a community approach, but funded and supported by government, but it remains in the community. And similar to Christianne, I really hope that restorative justice can start to engage and work with diverse folks, and that's people of color, that's gender diversity, that's there's just so much out there, so much diversity out there that and restorative justice the community has not reflected that historically, and I think that's a real hope of mine, is that shifts really significantly in the coming years.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's like RuPaul says, there's a color box of crayons, and why would you only choose one color when there's a whole rainbow of colors to play with? So thank you both so much for your time. Christianne Paras, Gillian Lindquist, the work that you do is so amazing and so inspiring. It's just an introduction for people watching this interview to what restorative justice is, the work that you both do, some of the things that need to happen to change it, to make it even better. But thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. Again, Christianne's book, Christianne's book is Colorizing Restorative Justice. She's a contributing author. I will provide a link again in the description below, as well to Restorative Justice Victoria, to the work that is happening in British Columbia. Thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate all the work that you do so much.